Nuxt is now connected to my JSON API, but what if I wanted to get these posts from another API, such as WordPress? The truth is that I'd have to update this all over the place, and these API calls are just too tightly coupled with my components. What I want to do where I have calls to WordPress, for example, is to make those calls more generic to a repository, and that repository could use WordPress or swap out the Storyblock CMS or the Strappy CMS. This is a common pattern called the repository pattern. In the root of my project, I'll create a directory called app, within there another called API, and then within there another called JSON. My app directory will hold things used on my Nuxt project, but not dependent on Nuxt. Next, within JSON, create a file called posts.js. Here I'll be creating an object, and within it an index method for listing posts and a show method which accepts a slug for showing individual posts. Go back to the blog slug and cut the entire Axios call, and let's paste that in our show method. Here I'll be accepting slug as a string now, and the response is just returned straight away, nothing else. I think this is a good time to catch any errors and log those instead of our components being responsible for handling errors. Awesome, now copy this whole chunk and let's paste it into the index method. We don't need a slug here, so we'll take all of that out. And we'll take the response as is. I can clean this up a bit by storing this URL in a variable called base URL. So I'll store that as a constant, and then let's use that down here as well. All right, to wrap this up, let's take this entire object and we're going to export it using fancy arrow function, and just paste that in and make sure to import Axios into the object here. Now I can duplicate this posts file and let's create pages. I'll just update the endpoint to hit our pages. I only need a show method, and don't forget the check for an undefined slug. Duplicate this again and let's create the menus endpoint. Update the URL for menu. We don't need the slug at all. We're really just going to use the base URL as is. And now I can create the repository that contains all three of these endpoints that we just made. So create a file called repository, and we need another object here where we will have our menus endpoint, pages, and our posts endpoint. So I'm going to import all three of those, then instantiate them on each of the keys in this object. And now we have everything from our JSON API wrapped up. I want to export this object as a constant, and I'll call it repository. With that, the last thing I need to do is pass Axios in from the top down into each of these files. Okay, so now how will I use this repository on all of my pages? Going back to the blog slug, what I want to do here is return from my repository the posts endpoints and the show method, which I'll give my slug. How beautiful is that? Then I'll take the response and I will assign it to post. And now the last thing I need to do is hook up repository. And to do that, I'll make my very own Nuxt plugin. So Nuxt Plugins provide this method called inject, which allows you to make functions available across your entire app. So that's perfect. To do this, all I have to do is come down to the Nuxt Plugins directory. I'll create a file called repository.js, and I'm going to be exporting a closure. Within the closure, the inject method. So I'll pass that in. And the key for inject will be the name of my object or repository, and then my repository function, which I'll import here. I do need to get Axios into my repository, and I'm going to get that off of context. So that was quite a bit, quite fast, but all we're really doing is injecting the repository we just built into Nuxt. We do need to let Nuxt know about this plugin, so in Nuxt config, add the Nuxt Plugins option with the path to our repository plugin. And now we can use it. So go back to the blog slug, and instead of passing in Axios, we're going to pass in our repository. And we can use that right here just by adding a $. Check that out in the browser, and the blog works. This is beautiful because our page is no longer concerned with an API. It's going to just hit a repository and expect to get a blog post back. That's all it knows. Go ahead and copy this whole function and head over to the blog index and just paste that in. Here, we don't need a slug, and we're going to replace show with our index method. And we'll set the response to posts, plural. Next, let's set up our global page slug template. Paste that async data function in again. Here, we'll be assigning the response to page, and instead of the posts endpoint, we'll use pages. And that's finished. Let's set up our menu next in the store. Instead of using Axios, we will use the repository, the menus endpoint, and the show method. With that finished, take a look at the site in the browser and you'll see that everything works as it did before, but we've now got our API completely decoupled from our components. In the next video, we'll set up factories for our pages, posts, and menu.